Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our new series of YouTube videos on improving your chess. I don't like to do a lot of videos on openings. I'm certainly not the world's biggest opening expert, and there's lots of videos on openings, but I'd like to do one about just what's the right way to learn openings. How much do you have to do? I get this question asked all the time, and I've written a lot about it, and I'd like to talk about it here in today's video. So the question is, how much openings do I need to know? How do I study them? One thing is clear. If we take the two extremes, the first extreme would be do nothing. Don't learn any openings. Don't memorize anything. Don't learn anything. Just kind of wing the opening. That's not good. If we take the other extreme, where you buy an expensive opening book which has 1,000,000 lines in it, and then you lock yourself in the closet and you try to memorize as many of those moves as possible, that's not going to work either. So the two extremes are clearly wrong. The one extreme of do nothing, and the other extreme of try to memorize every possible thing that anyone could ever play against you in your opening, that's not going to work either. So what does work? I think there's a two-pronged approach that would work. The first approach is learn the tabiyas for the main lines in your openings that you choose. And the second approach is after each game, use a book or a database or an engine to look up your game and ask yourself the question, if I had to play this game again and I played the same moves and my opponent played the same replies, at what point would I improve on my game? So for instance, if you're playing a certain opening and you make a mistake on move 5 and you look it up in the book and it says your fifth move is not very good, or it doesn't even have your move in the book. It says what you should do is this move. The next time you play those moves and somebody plays those replies, you can play the better fifth move. So what's a tabiya? A tabiya, I think, is Italian for table setter, or at least that's what I was told. A tabiya is the standard opening moves that you would play until the position digresses. How many opening tabiyas do you need to know? Well, it depends on what opening you're playing. If you're playing for white and opening like the London system, d4, d5, bishop f4, then the number of tabiyas you need to learn for white is lower because there's not a lot of lines that you have to memorize. Against that, you don't have to learn how to play against the Queen's Gambit declined and the Queen's Gambit accepted and so on. But if you're playing a d4 c4 player, if you're a d4 c4 player for white, you need to know what happens against the Queen's Gambit declined, what happens against the Slav, what happens for the Queen's Gambit accepted. And of course, you also have to learn the Indian defenses. See, if you're playing a London, you can just play bishop f4 against knight f6, and it is different, of course, than playing against d5, but it's only 2 lines. But if you're a d4 c4 player, then you have to learn against, King's Indian. You have to learn against a tabiya to play against a Grunfeld. You've got tabiyas to play. Now here you have to decide, when he plays e6, do you want to play knight c3 or knight f3? If you play knight c3, you would have to play against a Nimzo Indian, or he could transpose into a Queen's Gambit, or he could play a Benoni. If you play knight f3, he's got Bogo Indian and Queen's Indian. So there's various lines that you would learn. So if you're a d4 c4 player for white, you might have 8 or 9 tabiyas. If you're a London player, you might only have 2 or 3 tabiyas for white. Okay, so the tabiyas are the main moves, and I didn't show you the entire tabiyas. I just showed you the first couple moves to get you into the opening. So what is a tabiya? A tabiya is the main moves in that opening sequence that you choose up until the point where people really start to get a wide selection. So for today's video, I'm going to use as an example the Closed Ruy Lopez tabiya. I choose that because it's a really good and popular opening, and it's rich, but it's not super hard to understand. Now, when you're learning a tabiya, my suggestion is get out a book or a database that has the tabiya that you don't know, and the best way to do it is to find a chess study buddy. A study buddy is someone who likes to study with you. And what you can do is you can start out by playing the color that you're trying to learn, And you give your study buddy the book, because after all, you're the one who's trying to learn it and he doesn't know it at all. And you say, I'm trying to learn this line on page 73 here. And then you keep playing it over and over again with the color that you play in games, and he'll play the moves that the other side would play that you're trying to learn. And you just keep doing that until you get sick of it and you kind of have it memorized. Then I suggest you actually turn the board around, and you should play the opposite side so you can see what it looks like from the other side, and let your study buddy play your opening tabiya against you so that you see it the other side. And it shouldn't take very long to do that, because once you've done it for your side several times, you should be able to do it for the other side without a lot of practice. And once you see it from both sides and you can just do it automatically over and over again, then you kind of put those moves into your long-term memory. If your study buddy has an opening that he wants to learn, then you can take turns. You can do your tabiya, and then you can do his tabiya, and then yours, and then his, or yours, then hers, whatever. You just go back and forth learning the tabiyas. Then once you do that, you can play those tabiyas in speed games and see, how do people play? What lines do they play? How do they avoid the main lines? And that way you can slowly learn those side lines that go off your tabiya. All right, so let's take a look at the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya. All right, so the Ruy Lopez always starts the same way, which is white plays e4, black plays e5, white plays knight f3. If black plays knight c6, if white wants to play a Ruy Lopez, he has to play bishop b5. So that's the Ruy Lopez. These moves must be played by both sides to get into the Ruy Lopez. And now, what is the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya? All right, well, it takes both people. It takes two to tango here. Both sides have to want to play this. So black, to play the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya, would play a6. Now, does he have to play a6? Of course not. He could play, let's say, the Berlin defense, which is popular these days at the grandmaster level. And then you wouldn't be in the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya. You'd have to learn a completely different tabiya for the Berlin. You can't just play the same moves for white if black doesn't play the main moves of the tabiya. That could be disastrous. All right, so in the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya, black plays a6 and white plays bishop a4. Now again, there's lines. Bishop takes c6 is the exchange variation. But if you're white and you're learning the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya, you're going to learn to play bishop to a4. And now again, black has many sidelines that he could play. For instance, he can play a Steinitz deferred with d6 here. He could go for an archangel with, b5 and then bishop c5, that kind of thing. But if he's going to play the closed Ruy Lopez, and we're assuming that your opponent's playing the tabiya now, because if he's not, then you have to learn another sideline. Then knight f6, that's the main move. And now the main move for white is castles. And now you say, oh, can he take the pawn? And he can. Knight takes e4 is a good move. It's called the open Ruy Lopez. This is not what we're studying in the video today, but he can play knight takes e4. And most people, if they've never seen this before, play rook to e1 to skewer the knight and the pawn, which is a very reasonable move, but it's not the main move. If you ask the computer or look in the opening book, it's going to be d4. But we're not talking about open Ruy Lopez's today. We're talking about the closed Ruy Lopez. And in the closed Ruy Lopez, black plays bishop to e7 to threaten to take the pawn in some lines, because now there won't be any pins against the king to worry about. So white guards the pawn with rook to e1. And now the key here, and I've seen this error many, many, many times with lower rated players. Once white is guarding his e-pawn, he is now threatening to remove the guard with bishop takes knight and knight takes pawn. Now you might say, why couldn't he have done that before? Why couldn't he have done that way back on the third move? All right, so let's go back and look at that. It's always good to go over the moves of the tabiya over and over anyway. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop takes c6. Normally you take toward the center, but here in the tabiya for the exchange variation, black takes with the d-pawn. And now knight takes e5 is considered a mistake, because black can play queen to d4, double attacking the e-pawn and the knight. White would save the knight. Black plays queen takes e4 check, queen e2, queen takes e2, king takes e2. All right, so that's why you can't win a pawn. And in this position, black is doing fine. And I always ask my students, why is black doing okay here? And about 90% of the time they say because white can't castle. And that's actually the incorrect answer, because white can easily play rook to e1 and king f1 and activate his rook and tuck his king into safety here. The real reason why black is doing so well here is white's 4 pawns on the queen side against the doubled pawns cannot create a passed pawn very easily. In other words, the doubled pawns don't create any kind of crippled defensive pawn structure. But the main reason is because black has the bishop pair. The bishop pair means the advantage of the bishop pair, which means black has 2 bishops and white doesn't. At the start of the game, neither player has the bishop pair, even though they both have a pair of bishops, a common misconception due to the shortening of the advantage of the bishop pair into the bishop pair. But here black has the advantage of the bishop pair, just shortened to the bishop pair. Okay, so why is that important? Because once white guards the e-pawn, those kind of things are not possible for black. And after knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1, white is now threatening bishop takes knight, followed by knight takes pawn. For instance, I've seen many people here blunder and castle. And now I've actually seen many players with white blunder and not win the pawn. But you can just play bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes. And now a move like queen d4 doesn't work because of knight f3 hitting the queen, and the queen can't take the pawn. I've actually seen people make the mistake here of bishop g4. You might want to take a second and pause the video and say, why is bishop g4 a mistake? And the answer is, well, it's that tactic that I call counting. Counting means checking to see if there's any sequence of trades that would win material. And here there is. White will simply say, oh yes, you've pinned my knight, but it's not an absolute pin like you would against the king. It's a relative pin. I get a queen, you get a queen, I get a bishop, you don't get a knight, and thank you for the extra piece. So that would lose for black, bishop g4. All right, back to the tabiya, and again, it's good to start from the start each time. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1. So because of the threat of bishop takes knight, we now see one of the reasons why black played a6. It's so that in this position he can attack the bishop and stop it from taking the knight with b5. So the purpose of b5 here and not earlier is, now that white's guarding the pawn, bishop takes c6 as a threat, black can play b5, bishop to b3. Okay, so we've reached a very interesting position. For about 60 years, 70 years, from the early 20th century to the late 20th century, if black wanted to play the closed Ruy Lopez here, he would always play d6. And if he wanted to play the Marshall attack, he would castle so that he could play d5 in one move. But back around the 1980s, the grandmasters discovered that if they castle and signal the Marshall attack, but then don't play the Marshall attack and allow white to play an anti-Marshall, that's just as good for black as if they play a closed Ruy Lopez. They just have to study a few more lines. So in the old days, black would always play d6 for closed Ruy Lopez. And then we would see the moves c3, castle, h3, and I'll explain those in a second. But now, just as often as playing d6, you see castles, with the idea that if white plays c3, black can play d5 and play a Marshall attack, which is not a closed Ruy Lopez, although it starts out like a closed Ruy Lopez. But if black wants to, he can just transpose with d6, h3. Okay, so let's look at the old move order. It doesn't really matter. They'll transpose if both sides want to play the closed Ruy Lopez. So we'll look at d6. And now black is actually making a threat with d6. What's the threat? Well, a lot of people say to me, the threat's bishop g4. The answer is, no, that's not really a threat, because, white is not in any trouble yet. He can always just play h3 on that. The threat is to win the bishop pair for black. If white does nothing, let's say he plays the wrong move order and plays h3, black should play knight to a5. And now this bishop is trapped, and black will get the bishop pair. So after d6, the whole idea is to guard the e-pawn so the knight doesn't have to guard it, so the knight can threaten to go to a5. So white wants to preserve the bishop pair, and the way to do that is a move that does two things, which is c3. c3 gives the bishop a place to tuck away here on c2, but it also does something extremely important, which is it allows white to play d4, and if black takes the pawn, he can take back with the pawn and maintain these two pawns on e4 and d4. This is one of the major ideas of the Ruy Lopez, and in many of the lines, white plays c3 and then d4, and black can't really do much about that. White will get a nice solid center. That's why in these kind of lines, white does not play knight to c3, the natural square for the knight, because not only does that trap the bishop because the bishop can't come back anymore, but also white can't play c3 and d4. And now if white ever plays d4, black doesn't have to worry about white maintaining two pawns on e4 and d4. So the key idea here is to play c3. And again, you can play c3 earlier against some of the other lines of the Ruy Lopez for black. C3 and then d4 is a major idea so that you recapture with the pawn. So this is something really good to know, because beginners, this looks strange to them, blocking the knight's best square, that they would play c3. All right, and now black will castle to play the main line of the Closed Ruy Lopez. It's worth mentioning, even though we don't want to spend a lot of time in the video, that bishop g4 is a mistake here. The general principle to follow if you're playing black is don't pin this knight to the queen until after white plays d4, when you could pressure that square, the square that the knight and the queen is guarding. If white hasn't played d4 yet, then bishop g4 is usually not correct. And the reason here is white will play h3. If bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, wins the bishop pair. So black keeps the pressure on with bishop h5. And now white plays the star move d3. Again, this is not the main line of the Closed Ruy Lopez tabiya. We're looking at what happens if black makes the mistake bishop g4. And after d3 castles, white can play knight bd2, then let's say knight a5, then you save the bishop, c5, knight f1, queen c7, knight g3, hitting that bishop, bishop g6, and now knight to h4, and getting ready to bring a knight into f5. This is actually how a game went that my friend Jerry Coker, playing white, was playing against George Kramer at the New Jersey Open in 1968. And Grandmaster Bisgar came up to me and said, who's that guy there playing George? George has fallen into kind of an opening trap here. Okay, so let's go back. We're always going back. So we just looked at what black shouldn't do on his eighth move. Let's see what he should do. Knight c6, bishop b5, a6. Of course, black doesn't have to play these lines. That's why you need to learn more than one tabiya when you learn the Ruy Lopez. Knight f6, castle, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, d6, c3, and now we just saw that bishop g4 was bad because of h3, bishop h5, d3, followed by knight d2, knight f1, knight g3. So black's going to play the correct move, castle. Now if white plays d4, that's considered inaccurate because black can play bishop to g4, threatening bishop takes f3, and white can't take with the queen because he loses his d-pawn. So therefore, white wants to play d4, but he needs to prevent that pin first. So here is one of those few times where you prevent a pin with a move like h3. Usually you don't do that. But in this position, it's the main idea. And now no matter what black plays, white will play d4 almost on the very next move. All right, I mean, obviously, if black plays knight here, he'll first play bishop c2 to preserve the bishop. By the way, these bishops over here on c1 and c2, pointing to black's king side, are called the Lopez bishops. Since bishops can move all the way across the board, even though right now the pawns are partly in the way, they exert tremendous pressure toward the king side. A lot of king side attack possibilities there. Okay, so white's going to play an early d4 here, and if black ever takes, he gets to take back with a pawn and maintain the two pawns. That's one of the main ideas. And this is where the books start to separate. For instance, I bought the first Batsford book I ever bought was called The Closed Ruy Lopez, and the entire book basically started it from this position. It just says, let's say we play these moves, these 9 moves, 8 for black and 9 for white. Let's say we play these 9 moves, and what black now has a choice of many, many lines. Let's start looking at each one, and the book contains chapters on each one. Look, what are some of the main moves that black can play here? We're not going to talk about them in today's video. We're just going to list some of the moves. Knight a5 is called the classical variation. Goes something like that. Let's go back. Okay. Bishop b7 is called the Zaitsev variation. Knight to b8 is called the Breyer line. Black will reposition his knight to d7 and fink head of the bishop. That's the Breyer line. H6, I believe, is the Smyslov line. I think knight to d7 is a rare Kerez line. Even rarer is bishop e6. So let's see. Classical, Zaitsev, Breyer, Smyslov, Kerez. I think I've got all the major ones here. And some of the other moves like rook e8 might even transpose. So those are the main lines for black. And that's the closed Ruy Lopez tabiya for both sides. So white's trying to set up a strong center where he can play d4, and then later he'll play something like knight d2 to f1, and the knight will go up to e3 or g3 and try to hit these white squares here, the queen knight. And the queen bishop for white will often stay on c1 for a while. And a lot of times white plays the kind of break move a4 to try to break up black's pawns and make them a target on the queen side. So a4 is an idea too. But we're not going to get into that. We're not going to talk about Ruy Lopez late opening. We're just talking about the tabiya. So let's go through it one more time. And we'll talk about each move very briefly. Well, first we have to get into a Ruy Lopez. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. If your opponent doesn't play these moves, you're not playing a Ruy Lopez. Beginners sometimes think, oh, what if he goes there? I'll go here, he goes there, I'll go here, and I'm playing a Ruy Lopez. No, you're playing the Rossolimo variation, the Sicilian, and the moves are completely different. They don't make sense. For instance, if he plays a6 now, you can't play bishop a4 like in a Ruy Lopez, because after b5, bishop b3, c4, your bishop gets Noah's Ark, and you lose the bishop. So you can only make the Ruy Lopez moves if your opponent's doing the line. So here we have the a6 variation, sometimes called Morphy's move. Bishop a4, knight f6 hitting the e-pawn. White does not have to guard it right now. He can castle. Black can take the pawn. If he does, the main move for white, according to the computers and the grandmasters, is d4. If black wants to play the closed Ruy Lopez, he'll play bishop e7. White now needs to guard his pawn because that line is closed. Rook to e1. Now he's threatening to take the knight and to take the e-pawn. He's threatening to win a pawn. Black saves the pawn by preventing the bishop from taking the knight. Bishop to b3. And now black could castle and then play d6 to get into a closed Ruy Lopez, but he'd have to be willing to face anti-martial lines if he does that. Or he can play d6, which used to be played all the time. And now white has to face the threat of knight to a5 winning the bishop pair, so he plays c3, a really nice move that not only preserves the bishop, but prepares one of the main ideas of the Ruy Lopez, which is to play d4, and if black takes, take back with the pawn. Keep pawns on the d4 and e4 squares, at least early in the opening, to control those center squares. And now black will castle. We saw bishop g4 is premature. You don't play bishop g4 till white plays d4. And now white doesn't want to play d4 because of bishop g4, so he has to play h3. And that completes our tabiya. Okay, so this is the tabiya for the closed Ruy Lopez. And if you're going to play the Ruy Lopez, this is a good one to start with. And as we've mentioned, there's other main lines that black can play in the Ruy Lopez that eventually you have to learn. You learn a Steinitz and a modern Steinitz and a Archangel and an open system Ruy Lopez and so on. You know, there's several other major lines that black can play that you'll see quite frequently, and that's why you survey these by playing speed games to see what people do, to see which tabiyas you want to learn next. But you only need a few tabiyas. When I say a few, I don't mean like hundreds and hundreds, but maybe as you get to be a good player, you might learn dozens and dozens, but you're not going to learn the entire opening book. Now, obviously, if you're a grandmaster and you know who you're going to play and you've got a major line that you have to study for and you need a couple days to study up for him, well, then you're going to learn a tremendous amount of stuff in one particular opening that you know he's probably going to play. But most people aren't like that. They don't have opponents that are, they know who they're going to play and they're super booked up and they can, playing at grandmaster chess is a different level. So at our level, you learn these tabiyas, and when people don't follow the tabiya, you don't panic. It's the way it goes. They're not going to follow the tabiya all the time. Once you're out of your book, you take your time and you follow good opening principles. You don't keep trying to play tabiya moves. That's a big mistake very often. You just don't panic and you follow good general principles, and then you learn some new lines. You slowly learn them over the period of time. You learn more and more of these tabiya lines that will take you into what people normally play against you. Okay, hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you subscribe to our channel. We'll try to add more content. Not a lot will be on openings, but I really wanted to cover this one today. I think you enjoyed it. Okay, hopefully see you next time. Thanks. Bye.